Hey everybody, how's it going? Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I've got a great stream today, and I think we've got a nice change of pace. We had our first stream about sci-fi with Robert Heinlein talking about the Moon is a Harsh Mistress and Starship Troopers. Today we got the Distributist, Morgoth and Last Things all on, and we're going to be talking about Dune. So thanks for joining me, guys. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
No problem.
And of course, if you're here, you're probably already subscribed to Dave and Morgoth. But if you are not, I definitely have all of their links in the description. And then you guys should definitely also be subscribing to Last Things. He's got a great new channel. There's only a couple videos on there, but that's because he makes like hour-long deep dives. So you should definitely be checking him out as well. But I wanted to go ahead and start off the stream with just kind of a basic, kind of when did you first read Dune? How did it hit you? What age were you? And kind of what set it apart from the stuff that you were reading at the time? So Morgoth, why don't you go ahead and start?
Well, I didn't actually read the book until about 11 or 10 years ago. But I was aware of it because of the David Lynch movie, and I always thought it was a sort of dark Star Wars that I didn't quite understand. It was like in the 90s, it kind of faded out of me mind a bit, and then in the 2000s, it came back into my mind again. But I was against it because of me politics of the time. I thought it was like leftist apologetics for politics in the Middle East. So then I actually got the book when I became even more political in sort of 2010 era. And I came across a podcast on the alt-right website when it was just like an intellectual cultural forum. And they had a weekly podcast and they discussed Dune and about how amazing it was and how right-wing it was. And so then it kind of all fell into place, and I'd read it by then as well, and it kind of answered a lot of the questions that I had about it. So that's kind of like my story of Dune and my history with it.
And when you read it, how did you feel about it? Did it set itself apart in any particular way?
Yeah, I absolutely loved it. I mean, it still left me with a kind of feeling that it was odd and different, which we'll probably get into. But I mean, it's because it's the harshness and the bleakness, but then also I think it's kind of morally ambiguous, because when you get to the end of it, you think, well, did the good guys really even win? Like, it's not like they set about making a democratic, like a liberal democratic republic or whatever, and having a welfare state or anything like that. It's a galaxy-wide theocracy. So it's very different from what you normally get.
Yeah, when my wife, I introduced my wife to it, and when I introduced her with the mini series, and she got to the end, and she's like, "I don't think I'm supposed to like Paul." It's like, yes, exactly. But Dave, what about you? When did you first run into it?
So I say this having probably most popular video on my channel is explained to me when I ran into Dune. And how I reacted to it, but but I did a sort of Last Thing style deep dive on Dune. That's part of the series of my channel that I'm having a very hard time keeping up post family, but I intend to keep it up eventually. So I encountered it, I think sometimes when I was around 14 or 15, and I was on, I think all young men kind of go into a sci-fi kick around their early teens, or at least that was true with a lot of people I knew who were sort of the more intellectual young teenagers. And initially I didn't really know what to make of it because, I was into H.G. Wells and Isaac Asimov. And so Dune was an immediate departure from this. And I'm not so sure how philosophical you want me to get immediately about this, because I kind of have, I've kind of thought a lot about this because I had to make the video. And I guess the emotion that immediately kind of struck me with Dune was that it was not like Star Wars, that it was trying to do something diametrically opposed to Star Wars, that it was trying to tell a story that was sort of both inverted from the notion of sci-fi storytelling that you would get from a hard deterministic perspective, like you usually get from Isaac Asimov, who is intellectually the obvious brainchild of H.G. Wells. And it was also trying to just shatter the sort of sci-fi space operas of the sort of liberal, we're going to be the United States of America versus Nazi Germany in space, of the variety you get in Star Wars. In hindsight, I think what I was dealing with was the fact that Dune itself, it, like Morgoth said, it is sort of a brutal recontextualization of the sci-fi story, where our ordinary notions of progress are completely shattered by the utter force of history. History, I think, is the number one word that you should associate with Dune. And what Dune does is it shatters the notion of progress. It recontextualizes the narrative of history so that the narrative of history is no longer the narrative of technological progress, but a human story that extends beyond technological progress. And then the other thing, the last thing that it does is that this historical narrative dwarfs the plot and the characters. They stand in the shadow of history. Throughout how Dune is written, it's written so that there's historical excerpts from a historian, which happens to be the protagonist's future wife, quote unquote, telling this history of the story itself as if the story had already happened. And I think that's very important because everything about the plot in Dune and the characters in Dune, both inside the setting and after the story completes, are overshadowed by this notion of history. And in contrast to H.G. Wells, it's a very Carlylean history, not a very Wellsian history. And Wells was a person who tried to write a history of the world very famously, in addition to being the father of modern science fiction. So I don't know, that too, maybe that's a little too in depth, but
No, it's good. And I definitely want to hold that thread about whether you're talking about with history and progress, because that's something that I noticed when I was a young teenager first reading it, but it's something I didn't think fully understood until later in life. At first, when I was a teenager, I was just like, well, that's a cool way to make sure that people have to knife fight. In space.
Yeah, it's better than light swords that deflect bullets.
Right. It made a little more sense to me. But as I've gotten older, and thought more about the themes you're talking about, those have become definitely the pieces I've mined more and more out of Dune. But I will come back to that, I think, after we do some of the introductions. So last things, what about you? When did you first run into Dune?
Yeah, so I read it as I was probably about a 13-year-old when I first read it, and I read it just kind of very unreflectively as I was consuming a ton of sci-fi and fantasy at that time. But I reread it. I was in the middle of rereading it right around when Dave's Dune video came out, and I think I picked it up again because it seemed as though it was sort of regarded as this reactionary masterpiece, and as I was becoming more and more enmeshed in neo-reaction, I was like, okay, I got to give this thing a second read through. And the second time I read it, I was very fond of. I had this clever idea that I used to present to people about science fiction, where I always used to say, all sci-fi falls into one of two camps. It's either cyberpunk or Star Trek, which essentially is another way of saying it's either utopian or dystopian. It maybe takes a cynical attitude towards mankind sort of being mastered by technology, or the view that we will master our technology. I think the other way to kind of group this binary is, is the sci-fi about heaven or hell? Is it sort of right accelerationist or left accelerationist? I think another way of categorizing it is, Protestant versus Catholic. I think Morgoth kind of teased that idea a little bit in a video he did a little while ago. But I said this I was always fond of presenting this to people as a way of making myself seem incredibly clever. And then at one point somebody said, well, what's Dune? And I sort of stumbled on that. And I was like, well, Dune is Islamic, I guess. But it does have, I think, not to say that it isn't gritty and dark and maybe has kind of dystopian elements to it, but I think what fundamentally sets it apart from other science fiction, and I think an interesting question to pose is, even though it's considered sort of the Lord of the Rings of science fiction, is it in any real sense science fiction, because I don't think it's something that grapples with technology in a way that I think really categorizes science fiction. What sets it apart is that it all takes place essentially after the accelerationist moment that I think we're kind of all living in now. There are no coastal elites in Dune. There's the sort of the utopianist, technologist, rationalist stage of human history, where that was sort of the reigning elite ideology, has already kind of crashed and burned in a way that I don't think is present in any other science fiction. And what kind of takes the forefront instead of that dialectic is really religion. I mean, religion is foregrounded in a way that I can't say I've experienced in any other science fiction. So I think that's sort of makes it obvious as to why it is so well regarded in reactionary circles. And the Butlerian jihad is sort of alluded to throughout the books, which is essentially, the AI wars. Like, that's when man invented robots that rivaled our intelligence. But that's ancient history, and it's kind of returned to a kind of more primitive world in a lot of ways that just makes it strange that it has such regard in science fiction, when I think in so many ways it kind of contradicts the very premise of the genre, the category.
I mean, Dave was saying that in each chapter you have like a little introduction from the future as it's written by a history, and some of them, when you read them, I made a few notes of some of them, and I think Herbert was really revealing what he was doing with the book in these little snippets. And one of them says, the concept of progress acts as a protective mechanism to shield us from the terrors of the future. It's a quote by Gurney Halleck, which front loads one of the start of the book, which is then looked back on. So they think it's kind of a cope from the realities of the world is this liberal progressivism, which they're now looking back on as something of the ancient past. I mean, I do think what I've noticed about a lot of the sort of right-leaning science fiction is that they do have to deal with the technology problem, and usually it's just by destroying it, because I think it's difficult to have something sort of authentic and right-wing when it's Star Trek and you've got endless abundance, and you can just zap around, and there's not really any pressure between the women and the men and that kind of thing. And so I think if you want to create worlds like Dune, you really do have to find a way to bring the technology to heal.
Yeah, one of the things that I found interesting is obviously there's two adaptations really so far of Dune, which is the David Lynch movie and then the sci-fi miniseries. And I always prefer the sci-fi miniseries, even though I also enjoy the Lynch movie, only because it took Dune in the direction of not being dystopian. And that's one of the things I always found interesting about Dune, is that it presented a post-technology future without making it dystopian, I think. Well, I mean, don't get me wrong, like it is gritty in many places, of course. It's feudal, obviously, but it's not inherently, it's not cyberpunk. It feels like there's a world that people could be happy and prosper in. There are happy people in this place, and so I think that's what I always found interesting.
Well, it's a step beyond that. It has the audacities to suggest that. I mean, and now I'm not. This is partially ironic and partially sincere, but the characters certainly have the audacity to suggest that they're. I don't know if I want to call it anti-technological, but I want to say minimal technological universe is more human than our own technologically driven society. That you're hit with that right away in the first chapter. That what is being pursued is some kind of cultivation of humanness, and what's playing out is humanness in history once technology is not removed, but once the force of technological growth has been stopped. So technological growth beyond human growth can no longer influence history. So how do humans influence history? And how does history influence humans? And the characters right in the first chapter assert that what they're doing, what the kind of behavior they're exhibiting, and this what and I'm not spoiling much, but what in the first chapter you're thrown into is a brutal educational experience on the behalf of the protagonist that could have more than likely resulted in his death. And yet immediately not supposed to. The question is put before the reader whether they should actually be embracing this, which would in any modern context be regarded as absolute barbarism, as something that is more true and more real and more enlightened than what we would ordinarily think or expect from people in our modern world.
Yeah, the Reverend Mother, when she's testing Paul right out of the bat, says, I'm testing to make sure you're human, not animal, right? And that's pretty much beat over your head And to be clear, for anybody who's here and somehow is worried about spoilers from a 50-year-old book, we're gonna be spoiling everything. So just if you're worried about that, bail
this is
out
literally
now.
The first 30 pages.
Yeah, but we're gonna go well beyond that. So I just want to make it clear we won't be dancing around any plot points here. So if you're worried about that, do not continue. Come back later.
I think it's interesting that the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, they've actually had a master plan. So they're a sort of quasi all-female religious sect. And I was just browsing it before, and I didn't pick up on it when I read the book the last time, or in the video that I did about it, I think. But I think they may well be like the most interesting aspects of it. And I've only read like Dune itself, but they are trying to plan history so that eventually they will create it's a sort of eugenics breeding program to create the Overman at some distant point in the future, and kind of molding and nipping and tucking the flow of history. So you get that theme again, and it all goes wrong with Paul because of Jessica's love for Leto.
Yeah, can I comment on that? Because I'm not so sure how brutally I can spoil the plot of the Dune series, because I'm really tempted to here. But to spoil the plot of the original Dune, what is suggested in my interpretation of the original Dune is that what the Bene Gesserit are initially trying to do is they're trying to reinvent the concept of progress after it's been destroyed in the Butlerian Jihad. The story of the initial arc of Dune, and about that I mean the first 3 or 4 books, is the first book, that plan brutally failing, second book, that plan being taken away from them, and then third and fourth book, that plan being driven in the diametrically opposite direction that they wanted it to go. And then again, it's very important. You're absolutely right, Morgoth. In the first book, the Bene Gesserit are the actual antagonists to Paul's vision, not the Harkonnens. The Harkonnens are simply the scenery, right? They're simply the necessary battle that has to go on in the background. The Bene Gesserit are the intellectual opponents of Paul.
Yeah.
And they're also the intellectual opponents of what happens in the first 3 books, which is a series of supermen, not just one, but 2 really, take the plan, destroy it, reinvent a new plan, and then drive it in the exact opposite direction that the Bene Gesserit wanted to go. And it's very important that the Bene Gesserit, and the whole plan spans 10,000 years, and the only organization that's alive on one end of that 10,000 year period and on the other end is the Bene Gesserit. And by the end of the books, by the last 2 books, the Bene Gesserit have gone from being the antagonists to the protagonists, and they're trying to sort of pick up the pieces of their shattered worldview at the back end of this cataclysmic redesign of the entire human race and of the entirety of human history. Now, I think the last 2 books are much. I don't like how they're written as much as the first 3, for sure. But that is, I think, the overall vision of this series.
Yeah, I think a lot of people stop at Dune, and I understand why. I think everybody should read at least the first three to get the arc. But I think arguably the God Emperor of Dune, the fourth book, might be the best, or it's easily the second best book in the entire series, because it just takes it in such a different direction and gives it such a it really is unlike pretty much anything else I have read in sci-fi. The way it goes with the story, and the way it continues the themes and takes them in a different direction. So I think it's well worth reading beyond the first book.
I wonder if I started earlier by saying that Dune really kind of sidesteps a lot of technological questions, but I do think that with Leto the Second, it's not technological in the sense that it is, computer intelligence, but in some way he does become a sort of godlike AI. And in that way, maybe you do have a lot of the kind of classical sci-fi issues that are presented in a more, I guess, kind of mystical or magical format. But he does, I think, ultimately become a sort of supercomputer. I don't know if you guys would agree with that characterization or not.
I would totally agree with that characterization. Mm-hmm. Like that is, and it literally is sort of the inversion of the Bene Gesserit vision. The Bene Gesserit vision was a new rate. I don't know. This is my interpretation since it's never explicit, but it seemed that the Bene Gesserit vision of humanity was a series of supermen guided by the Bene Gesserit's constant teachings and vision of how the human race should be run. The God Emperor is literally the re-infantilization of humans under a God Emperor. It is really a reversal of the Butlerian jihad, with the one exception that the massive super AI is actually human and has human motivations. And I know I'm brutally spoiling this. And as you learn later, the whole idea is that, okay, so the Butlerian jihad was what liberated man from the slavery of AI, and the God Emperor is going to be the similar. It's an engineered mistake to liberate humanity from the shackles of messianic frauds, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, actually. Yeah, it also touches on the end of Dune, where it isn't just that the bad guys get overthrown and everybody's happy. It is a complete civilizational reset. Like the victory is complete and total civilizational renewal, or everything will be overthrown. It even says that, in the future books, that there's 60 billion people die, and the Emperor is stripped of all of his assets, everything. It's a complete victory for what will become the more sort of spiritual AI to replace the Butlerian jihad. I think that's a good point.
I had a question, and Auron, I don't want to jump in the way of any questions that you had planned. So stop me.
No, by all means, go for it.
I guess rather than all of us just praising the hell out of Dune, I thought I would kind of be a bit of a devil's advocate here and ask a few questions. One of which I had was, do you think if Frank Herbert were alive today, what would he make of the reactionary admiration of the book? I mean, I'm curious if he would be opposed to that interpretation or be sort of shocked that more right-wing personalities gained a fondness for it. The only time I ever heard him, it's very strange. Every time I hear him talk, or I just, he always talked about the book as this sort of ecological book. And I know obviously the theme of like the desert turning into, a fertile, like floral paradise is a theme within the book, but I would never, it's certainly not first and foremost a book about environmentalism. And he always seemed like he had that impression that he had made this sort of like environmentalist, beyond being reactionary, beyond being counter progressive. He was making this book that was concerned first and foremost with environmentalism. And that always seemed kind of tinny and weird to me. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Would he
I-
be on board with us, or would he be horrified?
Well, I thought I would just chip into that discussion because I made a few notes and collected some bits and pieces in preparing for the stream. And there's one quote by Frank Herbert, and he says, "It is demonstrable that power structures tend to attract people who want power for the sake of power, and that a significant proportion of such people are imbalanced, in a word, insane." And I thought that kind of analysis of power, where it attracts the crazies, it does seem very reactionary to me, as I come across that quite a lot.
I mean, okay, so I mean, there's sort of two things here. I'll go in reverse order. I'm sorry, pardon me. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Sorry about that. The first thing is on the ecology front. I would argue that the ecology, the ecological shifts of the desert world between being verdant and being desert-like is literally a reflection of the central messianic conflict between having a humanity in constant chaos, struggling against itself, and then having everything ruled over by an AI or a god emperor, right? The cycle of Arrakis between verdant paradise and brutal desert planet is literally the playing out of the cyclical history. And in that sense, I think Frank Herbert, I think when he says ecology, I think he's trying to, I don't think that Dune really has a big ecological message, except for the fact that that nature is not sort of this, I mean, leftists have this vision of nature completely in harmony with itself. Herbert has a vision of nature that is in cyclical equilibrium with itself. And I think that is a more accurate view of nature, and that's a more ecological view of nature. And that's something that's certainly more in line with sort of the cyclical view of history. As for would Herbert like reactionaries, I think that's not really the pertinent question. The pertinent question was, how would a Frank Herbert react to our modern progressive moment? Because if you were to take Frank Herbert from 1965 and transform him to 2012, I don't think him as a studier of history would find any of us reactionaries the most pertinent thing about 2021. The most pertinent thing about 2021 is the puritanical moral panic that we've been embroiled in for the last decade. That's the most pertinent thing. And the question is, what side of that puritanical movement would he be on? And it's always an impossible question to answer. My instinct is that he would be highly skeptical of modern 2021 progressivism, unless he had somehow been educated in it. But whenever you do that with historical figures, you get into these ridiculous hypotheticals. With Dawkins, and with Dawkins very famously commenting on the previous evolutionary psychologists from the 19th century, saying that they would all be egalitarians in the 21st. It gets to be kind of ridiculous, right?
Yeah, I'm one of these people, and I'm not a literary critic of any stripe, so don't think there's any of that in here. But I'm one of these people who once an artist has made something, I don't really care what they would think about it after. That's not what art is to me. I don't think. I think one of the beauties of art is that it doesn't suffer from idiots who go back and destroy their work later, which is now what we see today, unfortunately.
And I put it differently. I don't not care what the artist says, but an art piece is much more than what the artist says, right?
Right.
With the artist, if an art piece was an iceberg, what the artist says it is the tip of the iceberg, which is an important part of the iceberg. But you have to allow for the fact that the artist himself might be dipping into something that is much, much deeper. One of my first analysis videos I ever did on my channel was an analysis of Pulp Fiction, where I said that Pulp Fiction is basically a perfect Christian allegory if you read it that way. Do you think Quentin Tarantino really made a Christian allegory in Pulp Fiction? Probably not, but it's there if you wanted to see it, right?
Yeah, that's probably my favorite video of yours, actually, because it said something I'd always thought when I saw it. So I really enjoy that video.
I want to.
Go
Oh,
on then.
sorry. Well, I just wanted to kind of pull out one more aspect of Dune that I kind of go back and forth on, and I struggle with in terms of the intentionality. But if we consider, I think part of why reactionaries admire Dune is, if we take the Atreides, for example, I think a lot of people feel like we are being shown the kind of elites that we would want and the kind of the elites that we don't really have at the moment, like true aristocrats, people that have skin in the game. If we were all living in a mold buggy and patchwork, I assume everybody would want to go to the Kingdom Corporation run by House Atreides. There are these people that cultivate virtue. Leto the First does seem like a truly sort of compassionate, kingly person who cultivates virtue in Paul, and they're set up to be the kind of virtuous foil to the just sort of hedonistic and demonic Harkonnens. And yet on another level, there is this sort of view you could take of figures like Paul and Jessica as these utterly cynical elites in the way in which they manipulate the Fremen. I don't think it's ever asked directly if they are, kind of true believers in the Fremen faith, but they're so good at performing this Fremen, incorporating themselves into the religion. But in some way, that is done as sort of cynically and inauthentically as this is a kind of silly analogy of like Donald Trump appealing to evangelicals, or obviously, I think he had in mind Lawrence of Arabia with the Paul figure, but I don't know. I guess I just present that to you all. Like there's that duality to the Atreides where they are both, I think, and I think at the level of the language, at the level of the writing, Herbert obviously loves the Fremen. Like they have they have the best poetry, they have the best lines. But there is, I guess in some way this is a Marxist critique, or I'm playing the role of the left-wing devil's advocate. And what we are really being shown here is not a more kind of pre-modern aristocracy, but an aristocracy that has become so good at manipulating people and so cynical that they can write themselves into a religion as a messiah.
Well, Herbert sets it up so that religion is manufactured for that purpose, right? That's literally the reason the religion exists, is that it's planted there for that purpose.
Right.
Oh, just to recap on the nature of the elites as well. So you do have the Atreides, and they are good people, and then they are killed off Game of Thrones style, just as you get to know them and you warm to them. But then the elite itself, the power structure itself, is like centralized under a corrupt figurehead. It's run behind the scenes by a trading guild, and it sort of uses it as its main bully boy, a complete degenerate scumbag. So as a sort of comparison to where we are now, it seems like completely spot on. I cannot really fault Herbert's vision in that regard.
Yeah, if you want to do an interesting thing, if you want to shoot it through a different lens, you can look at it through the Juvenile lens, right? So if you want to look at it through kind of Juvenile and his explanation of, in On Power, of like how elites get replaced, the low, high versus middle, Paul is using these beleaguered people as a fulcrum to unseat a corrupt, inept aristocracy and replace it. I think if you want to look at it a certain way, there's you can easily see how that would get applied.
This is maybe I should be more critical of Dune, because I think this is really fun, but in addition to having some sort of some writing style problems, Herbert certainly isn't the wordsmith that Tolkien is, if you were to compare it to Lord of the Rings. A common criticism of Dune, and one that I kind of agree with, is maybe this is necessary for it to make its points, but sorry, I have a child playing outside. Maybe this is necessary to make its point, but the characters are very hard to sympathize with. I remember reading this book when I was 15 and giving it to a classmate in high school who was female, right? Who was also a sci-fi fan. She absolutely hated it. She was a big fan of Ender's Game. And her criticism was, nobody in this book is sympathetic.
Mm-hmm.
They're all going around thinking, what, they don't have friends. They just go around thinking, what do I get if I kill this person? What do I get if I kill this person? And I didn't really, I guess this is just maybe a difference between the sexes, but I didn't think at all like that. And I thought, well, what about Lady Jessica? Isn't she really sympathetic? But I reread the book as an adult, and it was like rereading The Fountainhead. It was like reading a completely different book. I'm like, what is this? I read about Lady Jessica, and she's a total, she loves her son, and that's it. But her love for her son is not very motherly. It's very Machiavellian. She just wants him to survive. And she's willing to emotionally manipulate even him. And other than that, she's far from being, this loving mother character. She's completely cynical.
Yeah, this is my wife's criticism of it too. Is exactly this. She's like, no one here is likable. I can't root for anyone here. Like, and that makes it interesting because then everyone becomes an avatar of like forces and ideologies, and it lets you look at things because people end up kind of being distilled versions of worldviews and forces, which is appealing in some sense. But it certainly does mean that characters do not come off as kind of realistic, total people, which is itself its own problem.
So Morgoth, the only thing I would take only one issue with what you said earlier. It's not that the Atreides gets killed off Game of Thrones style. It's that the Starks get killed off Dune style.
Yeah.
It's funny. I've never. It was obvious to me the first time I read Game of Thrones, the first time I saw it, that at least book one and Ned Stark he's absolutely a Leto figure, and not to diverge to Game of Thrones, but I've just never heard anybody make the obvious, just state the obvious that the entire sort of plot of book one, Game of Thrones, is just a carbon copy of Dune.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been looking into like creative writing and how these things put together, and you'll often see George R. R. Martin pop up. And he has this idea that there's two kinds of, when it comes to fantasy and science fiction especially, that there's two kinds of writer. And there's the gardener and there's the architect. And George R. R. Martin is the gardener. And the gardener will create very well fleshed out characters, and he'll put obstacles in their way, but then the characters always have to react in keeping with their character. They have to be consistent. And this means that George R. R. Martin has actually no idea where this is going to lead, because it's the characters that he has to be consistent with the characters. And the architect is somebody who has it all planned out beforehand. And I think it's fair to say Herbert was an architect, because the weakness of the architect is that you do know where it's going to go, but the problem is you then have to just kind of do a paint by numbers and fit everything. Well, this has to happen here, so that means this character has to do these things and be like this. The problem for the gardener strategy is that you have no way to wrap up the book at the end of it all, which he hasn't finished, and Dave's done a stellar video on that too.
Well, I get really, when people present videos, I get really nervous on stream. So stop it. But to go back, this is really interesting though, right? Because to answer last thing's criticism, right? George R. R. Martin is a tried and true progressive. And the thing is there are 1,000 organic ways to end Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire in a reactionary way. You could end it in a classical reactionary way, like with a good king ascending the throne. You could end it in a sort of neo-reactionary way, like Dune, where there's just some kind of transcendent messiah that totally upends the entire culture of the universe. You could end it in a Nietzschean way, or you could end it in a total cynical way, where everyone just dies and, the undead king takes the throne in a fit of irony. But the problem is, because he set up reactionary parameters. There's no progressive way to end A Song of Ice and Fire that does not feel cheap, cheap, cheap. And I think, you know, even the people who ended the TV show, they ended it in a progressive way, and then they threw one spanner in the works. They threw one thing that was off narrative, and they got an unending amount of shit for just that little deviation. And I think that this sort of shows you. I don't know. I don't want to kind of digress this into a conversation about progressivism, but I feel that as a gardener, what's stopping George R.R. Martin from being even a really good gardener type writer is the fact that he's sort of enthralled with a philosophy that just can't realistically deal with any subject matter. So he can't write realistic fantasy.
Yeah, and that's hopefully one of the things that's eventually going to move us beyond this point is, you know, access to a worldview that can actually do better when it comes to creating fiction. But I wanted to drag us back to Dune here. So one of the things that Dave brought out kind of when he was giving his introduction was Dune and looking at, you know, progress and history and its very unique approach to kind of, you know, post-technology or kind of, you know, post-technology driven advancement of humanity, and kind of how that changes the style and the story and where that brings it. Did you want to go a little more into that, Dave, or does anybody else want to, you know, talk a little bit more just kind of on how Dune focuses on the improvement of the human and kind of separating technology and that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I believe history is the subject of Dune, and I believe that that what Herbert means when he says ecology is and this is me spitballing, but I think he means is that ecology has history and history has ecology, right? So what Herbert is talking about is the ecology of history itself. How does it wax? How does it wane? How does it transform from one biome to another? And the number one thing about ecology is that the ecology, is that a proper noun? I forget. The ecology dwarfs the organism that the ecology contains. So you can talk about a wolf in the ecology, but the wolf is adapted to the ecosystem of the tundra. And the tundra cares not for the wolf. And the same thing is true for the characters in Dune. They're adapted to the ecology of history. And the drama is basically them reacting to an ecological shift.
That's interesting. You know, that Dave, that puts me in mind of I remember reading this description that G.K. Chesterton had about the Buddha and Christ. He was responding to a lot of people commenting on the similarities between Buddhism and Christianity, and he characterized the figure of the Buddha as it's seen in iconography with, you know, a laughing mouth with eyes closed and this big belly. And then you have these images of the saints that are all kind of Fremen-like, very, very frail, but with these bright eyes, all sunk in, you know, like they're starving to death, skinny, frail saints, and these two sort of images. And the Fremen throughout the series kind of, you know, as the books progress, they start describing them more and articulating them more as like, you know, they, you know, as water becomes more abundant, they become, you know, more attractive. They're, you know, you can't sort of, they look less and less like a desert people. And that coincides with their sort of eventual, I guess, spiritual degradation, as their environment gets more fertile and fecund. They themselves sort of lose this intensity and this spiritualism. It also kind of reminds me of a tweet that Zero H.P. Lovecraft put out at one point that I'll butcher, but he was saying, you know, the reason why we live in such spiritually impoverished times is because of abundance, because of our technological abundance, because of our resources. And I do think you're right. I think that is something that is Frank Herbert is playing with.
I'd say I mean, predictably, I'm going to do the Spengler take, but there is a very sort of Spenglerian angle on it, where you do have this kind of material. He even uses the word megalopolis in the book of Frank Herbert. And there is like an angle on it where it has become this corrupt, bureaucratic, materialist, decadent, empire, and it's destroyed by spiritual rebirth. So it's like it's already at the winter stage, and then what Paul is going to unleash is the spring again, and just sort of washing it away, literally washing it away with the rain, which will eventually fall on Dune.
I'm proud that it took us 45 minutes for Spengler to enter the conversation. I was waiting for somebody to, ask, is Herbert a Spengler man?
It was going to be me. I'll not get too carried away on it though.
Oh no, please! I really love your digressions on Spengler. I haven't been able to get a book for myself and actually find time to read it. So, yeah, that's great. Yeah,
it's definitely Spenglerian in that way, because it does have all of the hallmarks of this waste, and you've also got the people of the land, which are the Fremen, sort of wandering around outside of history. They've been pushed out of the megalopolis, out of the materialist paradigm, but they are out on the land as an unknown entity. And you've also got that their life source of the land is being sucked into the cities by all these greedy, degenerate guilds and lords and barons and whatnot. And they find that the spring comes again and the cycle kickstarted again. It's very Spenglerian in that way.
All right, so what do you guys think about the books beyond the first one? Do you think that most people should move on? Do you think Dune is best understood in one book, or do you think that that the story meaningfully continues on? I agree with Dave that Chapter House and such are not the strongest entries, but like I said, I feel like you should probably at least move through God Emperor of Dune.
I think that. Oh, go ahead.
I can't really comment because I've seen one terrible series on the God Emperor of Dune or something, or the Children of Dune, but I don't really know. I haven't read them.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked. So, I mean, the second and third book, a lot of people don't like because it basically removes the proxy adventure set of the story, and it solidifies the sort of ideological conflict between Paul and the Bene Gesserit. But I think that in many ways, the second and third one are where the point of the first book really comes to a head in a lot of ways. And the fourth book, that's a little bit difficult because although the fourth book is very quotable and does put a nice capstone on what the second and third book introduce, it's not a very compelling plot. I've read it. I hardly remember the characters or what happens. I feel like they just sit around and speak in aphorisms for most of the time, which is fine if you're interested, trying to figure out where Frank Herbert thinks about what he's created. But it doesn't exactly make for very compelling fiction. I don't know. I would say that if you're interested in the philosophy, if you're interested in Dune as an adventure story, stop with the first one. If you're interested in seeing Frank Herbert's point more pointedly with Paul as the Messiah, go to the third book. And if you want to see exactly where Frank Herbert thinks that messianic journey is going to end, read the fourth book. And if you also want to hear a bunch of Herbertisms spoken to in length, you can read the fourth book. Obviously, in the fifth and sixth book, Frank Herbert wanted. I mean, that should be just an entirely different series, right?
It feels like he was trying to do that.
Yeah, it feels like how. And this is actually I'm going to irresponsibly tempt us into digressing onto Gene Wolfe, which in many ways I think is a companion piece to Frank Herbert's Dune, from a much more Catholic point of view. But Gene Wolfe did this where he had one trilogy or whatever. He had one series of books that had one arc, and then he had a different series of books that did a completely different one in the same universe. It really should be seen that 5 and 6 were trying to do something completely different were no longer even on the same story. They just happened to take place in the same universe.
What about you, Last Things? Have you read Beyond the First?
Well, I've read up to and through the third book, Children of Dune, though I'm familiar with the entire arc of the story, so it's probably not fair for me to weigh in completely. I mean, I will say if people have only read Dune and they love it, it's certainly you're going to shatter your framework and your perspective. So if you've just got kind of warm, fuzzy feelings about Paul Atreides, I hate to shatter them. That's not to say there isn't a lot of meat and significance in the other two books, and I plan on reading the last three this year. I paused in the series to finish up Gene Wolfe. Funny you bring him up, Dave. But yeah, you can't go back again. I'm tempted to say it's like watching the newer Star Wars movies if you love the trilogy, but there's obviously qualitative differences.
Speaking of non-qualitative differences, no one be tempted to read either the prequels or anything coming out of Brian Herbert or the stuff that is not actually written by Frank Herbert. It's just I don't know. I haven't read it all, but from what I've seen, it's just terrible all the way through.
It's I've read all of them.
Really? No way, really?
I have probably read at least 30 Dune books, maybe more.
More man than I.
Well, I read most of them as a late teens, early 20s. But yeah, I liked them then. If you've ever read like the Star Wars expanded universe, they very much have that feel where it's kind of cranked out by a series of authors, except they're supposed to only be the same two, but it really feels like they've been handing them off to multiple authors, like they do with the 40K universe and the Star Wars universe and all of them, and they have exactly the same feel. Some of them feel really good. I enjoyed them a lot. Some of them are obviously super trash and we're just cash in, and so I'd say some of them are enjoyable. I enjoyed the original, the house books that came out, the first three that were specifically on like the backstories of the houses, and a few of the Bethlerid and Jihad ones. But in general, I wouldn't say they're of the highest quality. They're really more of a soapy. It's a beach read. I wouldn't expect any deep thought out of it. All of the philosophy is gone. For sure.
I know I don't want to dominate this conversation at all, but just so I can stick my nose in here again, I will list one Dune book that I thoroughly enjoyed reading. Hard to find, not written by Frank Herbert, the Dune Encyclopedia from like 1982. It's great because it's an in-universe encyclopedia that fleshes out the universe. And what I really appreciated was the fact that a lot of the articles in the Dune Encyclopedia are written as if it's somebody from the Chapter House of Dune era trying to figure out what happened and speculating that some of the things that you read about in the original Dune book might not have happened, that these might have been fictitious happenings. And maybe Paul was like, he might have been multiple people, right? And combined into one person. There was like the dead son of the Duke, and he was combined with this desert wanderer. And, these two forces had to have a common leader, right? I don't know. I found that book very delicious, but not philosophically meaningful.
Yeah, like I said, I really think that you lose any of the big themes once you get outside of anything Herbert wrote himself, and they really at that point just become it's like I don't know if anybody's read any of the Ender Games books beyond the original three, but it exactly feels like that. Like they're just cranking them out to make a beach read.
Reading Brian Herbert really makes you have a greater appreciation for Christopher Tolkien as a man who just sort of sat on his desk.
Yeah, really.
Wasn't like, do you guys want to read my story about Bilbo's great granddaddy and how he too defeated Morgoth? He was just like, this is what my dad wanted. This is his estate. Keeping it under wraps.
It's funny because before we went on air, we were touching on Warhammer and how it was influenced by Dune, and I'm like coming to the end of my 5th Horus Heresy book. So, I mentioned the last time I did a video on Warhammer a month or so ago, and I said it's actually interesting to read bad books. And I got that from Joseph Heller years and years ago. I read Catch-22, which is quite possibly the most cynical book ever created. I've never read a book as cynical as Catch-22. It's worthy of a separate discussion itself. But I was looking at what he had to say about writing, and he was saying it's really important for young men to read bad books and not just always the classics, because you kind of need a frame of reference as to when it doesn't work. And and what I thought, like on if I can just set this up. I was reading this the other day, like Fulgrim, who's a Primarch. I think the audience are going to be more acquainted with the average with Warhammer, so I'll just plow on. Fulgrim,
unfortunately, we all are.
Yeah,
unfortunately,
we're all geeks. So Fulgrim is a Primarch who's turning to chaos, and I don't know what the writer was. I forgot. I didn't pay attention at book 5 who wrote it. But what happens is he's on this beautiful planet, and it's a meetup with the Eldar, a dying race of elves, and there's confrontation and there's tension, and then the Eldar send down this demigod who contains their spirits, and there's like page after page after page of building up the mystique and the mythology around this creation, this ancient monster, this powerful spiritual element. And then Fulgrim like charges towards it, has a fight, and he ends up getting it in a headlock and bring it to the ground and punching its face in and taking out the spirits and crushing it in its hand. And I thought you've spent like page after page after page building this thing up, only for it to descend into like Hulk Hogan versus The Undertaker, like to have him pinned into the headlock, getting punched in the face. And
but Morgoth, that's literally the plot of Beowulf.
Yeah, well,
Beowulf, like if you read Beowulf, and there's a great translation by Seamus Henley, I think, and it's like page after page about how awesome Beowulf's armor is and how horrible Grendel is, and then like he gets, it's just like it literally is WWF fighting. Like he literally like yanks his arm off or something like that, right? It's just like
I was if you put that on Dune, it would, because they do that with the worms as well. You know, you've got the thumpers in the ground, and then you get the ground begins to shake, and there's this build-up of tension. And imagine the worm like bursts through. You know, it's a mile long, and it bursts through the sand, and then somebody just sprays it with bug repellent, and it dies. Like that's part of that. It didn't happen, of course, but that's what you've got to watch out for, and that's why it's kind of interesting to pick up a chibi novel and just to laugh at. I mean, in Warhammer in general, you really just have to laugh at it. But yeah, I do take the point about Beowulf. It's like WWF, is it wrestling? WrestleMania, but it's like gods that they've spent pages and pages building up. And that really amused me, that whole thing.
I feel like that's 40K in general, right? Is like you just have these epic world-spanning pieces of sci-fi that kind of like chisel off the best parts of everything, throw it together, and then like the orcs conquer the world because they think red goes faster. You know, like that's 40K in a nutshell.
And it's like, oh well, they've just genocided an alien planet, and oh look at this, there's a silver sword. And you think, well, how did it get there? Like, how did he know it was there? Well, why is it there? And it's kind of, it doesn't matter. We'll figure that out in book 23. Just go with it. It's going to be fun.
I mean, but you know, Warhammer is WWF in space. But then you think you've really dissed it. But then you realize that the Iliad is WWF with Achilles versus Hector. Basically, the first half of the book is just like the microphone match. You know how like in all WWF fights they have like the microphone match where they flesh out their backstory and how big of a grudge this is. There's I think what Joseph Heller is getting at in Catch-22, or sorry, maybe he didn't say this in Catch-22, but the author who said you needed to read bad books is that the fundamental manliness of that pervades bad books is not actually that different from the fundamental manliness that pervades classics. If you talk about the Iliad and the Odyssey, or to go to a non-Western culture, everyone know the Bhagavad Gita?
Right? Yeah, you could do the Epic of Gilgamesh too, Dave.
Epic of Gilgamesh is a bro story, right? It's about bros. It's bros in Samaria. That's what Epic of Gilgamesh is. But the Bhagavad Gita is also about bros, and they're just bro stories. And you realize that a lot of these stories, their initial versions were probably not too dissimilar from just trashy male entertainment stories. And what happened was that a lot of sages built the wisdom in very, very slowly, or maybe all at once. Maybe it was one sage that built all the wisdom in. And maybe that's not so dissimilar from this is why death of the author kind of works, right? The Iliad is a product of death of the author. Homer is not the author of the Iliad, even if Homer did exist. He is a poet who's retelling the story that was told to him in more poetic language. Stories that have archetypical truth to them, and this is very particular in manly bro stories, these things can be used to uncover much deeper philosophical truths, even if the original story didn't mean to have any kind of significance to them. It's sort of like, this might be an apocryphal, well, it was sort of like how, I don't exactly know where he said this, but someone like, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the author's name. Old Man in the Sea.
Hemingway.
Hemingway used to say that like these true stories of hardship and manliness, as long as they're told truly, as long as they're told plainly, the meaning will kind of find you in the story. You don't need to set out to have, and this is sort of the opposite way that I write. But you don't need to set out to find something meaningful in a story that's told in very, very plain fashion, and not to put too fine of a point on it. But this is what stops a lot of post-Great Awakening literature from even being usable as an archetype. The dumbest bro WWF story can be used to seed the future generation of epic philosophy, but no woke story ever does the same, with the possible exception of something like Black Panther, for reasons we could get into. Basically, there's more of a classic story there because they flip the race, right, and then it becomes kosher. But with a lot of these exceptions, the post-Wokening story isn't truthful enough to be the proper seedbed for deep philosophy to grow out of.
Dave, post-Wokening, maybe this is an interesting segue. One question I had for all of you guys is, what probability do you all have on the new Dune adaptation just being utterly paused? Are you guys holding out hope for it? I think that visually everything I've seen looks stunning, but I think there are also reasons to anticipate it's going to be compromised.
Yeah, there's a certain amount. I mean, it's obviously the diversity quotas, and for me it is. And you can see at who's playing the Fremen, and in a sense, they can say, well, they look North African because that's a landscape and that kind of thing. For me, it is like the director himself, Villeneuve, is one of these directors who's coming to grips with the fact that he has to do this if he wants to operate in Hollywood. And so what they try to do is make it as sort of subtle as possible. And I think he's had a go at that as to what he can get away with in Dune. Christopher Nolan has been quite good at this as well. Mm-hmm. So that I'll see how it goes. I will watch it. One thing that I wanted to say, just to sort of round off on the topic of the doing earnest literature, and I think the answer to that is metamodernism. And something like Dune we'll see is a classic, but it is a book where all across the dissident right you'll find young men they find something in certain aspects of pop culture, and the rest they'll regard as complete garbage, rightly so. But then you'll find that some things like Dune, Blade Runner 2049 comes to mind, and the original Blade Runner, and to a certain extent the last Mad Max movie. There's certain things that they kind of latch onto and they think, okay, it is in clown, we are in clown world, but there's something in this, and there's something in this that speaks to me. And I think what it is that and Warhammer as well thrives in this environment. And I think what it comes down to is like a meta-modern attitude where it's like we understand the pause exists and we acknowledge it to a degree, but it's just that we've stepped over it and we don't care. It isn't that we're shocked by it. It isn't that we're caught out by it. It's just that we acknowledge it and we are moving it on and looking back at it. But we do bear those scars of it, and we're not going to pretend that we don't. This is essentially the yes meme, right? It's just you're gonna like this. You're gonna like this movie about space knights and like jihad in the desert on a futuristic planet, and it's just like unapologetically. I understand where you're coming from. I know what your mentality is, which is postmodernism. But I do like that stuff. It's the yes meme, and this is sort of a way forward to think about narratives and creating culture.
You know, I just got done rereading Abolition of Man, and I recorded a video. I gotta edit everything down for it.
That is a great classic. No modern person who wants to interact with new ideas should ever not read that book. It's essential.
Yeah, and I'm someone who read it in my mid-teens the first time, so rereading it now was pretty eye-opening in a different direction. But not to like rehash the video, but that I've already recorded. But basically, just Lewis makes a prediction that people will get so manipulated that we'll master the inputs and the outputs of people so well that we'll basically abolish man, and we'll create something that doesn't really resemble humanity, because it never had access to the spirit in the first place. And so and he just talks about how the different parts of education are just designed to make people cynical and remove the spiritual and the understanding of good and beauty, and just make everything sneering and ugly. And so I think there really is a point at which just embracing beyond, moving beyond and stepping over that thing that has been baked so heavily into the culture, like Morgoth is saying, is really essential to make good culture going forward. And I think that is something, so we can definitely use more of, and anybody who has any kind of inclination towards making any kind of art really can make, I think, much better stuff than is being proffered now, because you'll have access to something that those who are stuck in Hollywood or those trying to please progressives just simply don't have access to. But that said, do you guys, are there any other theme, or did you want to touch more on the day?
Sorry, I have my mute on, but I should say, Auron, you should really have this panel back on for a separate discussion of pulp and the possibility of creating a new pop culture, because a new pop subculture in this moment, because I think this is sort of fertile ground.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, everybody here is definitely welcome back. We're spanning, I think, like 9 time zones right now, but anytime we can put this panel back together, I think that would be great.
Yeah, it's something I'm busy with a project on the side right now. It's difficult to do, but I'm having a go.
Excellent. Yeah, no, people always say that. I'm like, I just don't think I'm a fiction writer, guys, but I desperately hope someone is. That's one of the things I like about Last Thing's channel is, he's not just doing the the news of the day stuff. And I hope we see more and more of that.
Yeah, I really liked Last Thing's video on. Well, I like both of them, but I particularly like the one on A Quiet Place.
Oh, well, thank you guys. I mean, you're all what inspired me to get recording. So that's fantastic to hear. I am attempting to write a little bit of right-wing pulp in my my limited spare time too. But yeah, I think a pulp. I think we could all get together and talk about 40K at some point too.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. It's like I definitely need to make a 40K stream with these people.
Or
40K is pretty.
it's not just 40K. Like Solomon. I mean, Solomon Kane and Conan. Anyone? I mean, do people like those things? Or are those popular? I guess maybe not so much.
Let me put this out here. But by the way, if somebody should create a Weird Tales style reactionary like periodical, like a monthly short story catalog, and when they do, this is free. Take this. The title of that magazine is God Emperor. That is the perfect title for a reactionary quarterly review of short stories. God Emperor.
Well, you've got Zero HP Lovecraft out there, right? He's doing that kind of thing, and I know he's writing for. I want to say, was it Raw Egg Nationalist? It's somebody on Twitter who's putting together like a monthly or a bi-monthly with a bunch of kind of right-wing Twitter personalities submitting short pieces, that kind of thing.
I'm not sure how you read Zero HP Lovecraft in print, because he has he's incorporated hypertext and links into his literature in a way that's very, kind of stunning, but I don't know how he'll ever translate to print.
I think it will be interesting to have, like I was talking about the gardening George R. R. Martin, and I think it would be interesting to have as a sort of community effort where somebody lays down a sort of a foundational text of a fictional work, and then other people are invited to write essays or short novels adding to the lore. But there would have to be a panel to sort of say, well, you can't do that, and there's these rules that can't be broken in the universe. Except for that, it's kind of like, submit it, and you just add it on piece by piece. It could turn out to be a complete mess. But because that was my impression of the Warhammer world when I got into it. But now,
I think that's how the Black Library works, Morgoth. I think you get like a little sheet that's like, don't kill these people off, and now go at it.
Yeah, so if you wanted to submit a novel, it would be easy to, as this little battle takes place on some obscure planet and it doesn't have any ramifications going in. But what you would not be able to do would be to say, well, actually, Horus turns out to be a great guy or something like that.
Give the progressives enough time, Morgoth, and they will absolutely say that Horus was a great guy.
ContraPoints already identifies themselves as an avatar of Slaanesh, so I don't think we're that far off at all.
something Cthulhu, something swims. Yeah, no,
I wanted to second Morgoth. That's an amazing idea. The only problem I foresee is that in order to get an IP that everyone agrees on, you have to have that initial little spark, right, to get everyone co-authoring fiction inside that world. And so it really is a question not so much of momentum, because I think that idea would build momentum very quickly. I would be tempted to write in a shared universe a small story, right? I think the difficulty is just getting that initial investment, that initial explosion of interest in some kind of brand or something like that would be somehow controlled but at the same time open.
I'm happy to share with any of you guys my notes and my drafts for my pulp, my reactionary pulp world that I've been toying with. If you guys want to try to
that would be
in the sandbox.
That would be interesting, but I think it would have to, the initial, I'm not saying that would be a bad idea, last things. Like, I'm open to really any person who wants to do this, but the initial thing would have to not be someone's notebook. It would have to be like an initial work that was very like a video game or a role-playing game or something that people could kind of point to. So I don't know. It would have to be a lot of people trying things, and then for some reason something resonates. I don't know. I'm spitballing.
Well, I think the key is always just do it, right? I think we definitely benefit from people getting involved in those projects, and I think the idea of having one of these kind of, these expanded universe pulp mills, because that's exactly what happens with both the Black Library and the Star Wars expanded universe. When that was a big thing, was they basically had, dozens of authors working simultaneously, just off last thing was saying, like a sheet of like, all right, here's what the universe does. Here are the things you can't do. Here's the general area you're writing in. Go make this. And that's why you can see the quality waiver so much. For instance, in the 40K books, I forget the name of the really good author, the one who did the first book in the Horus Heresy.
I know who you
Dan
mean.
Abbott, maybe?
Yes, Dan Abbott.
Yeah, it was really great book. Yeah, it was high quality.
Yeah, any of Dan Abbott's stuff inside the 40K universe is excellent, and you can if you see Dan Abbott on it, you can pretty much like cash that check. Like he's particularly good when he does, like, I think he does the IG stuff, the Imperial Guard stuff, and when he writes some of the ironically the best, or probably not ironically actually, the best stories in the 40K universe about the normal guys coping with the 40K universe. But he has, especially his short stories are particularly good when they're in those areas. But then, it varies. But having a universe like that where people could plug in and be like, all right, man, we're kind of working in this general direction. Here's what the characters are like, go at it, write something, tell us what you want to do in this universe. I think that would be great.
I had a creative writing professor in college who he had gotten his hands on basically the rules for if you wanted to write a Harlequin romance, like a bodice ripper, and he gave this to us all, and as an exercise, we all had to like write a story that negotiated this, like these 10 bullet points, and I'm sure they have the exact thing at Black Library, but it's funny. It's like, your romantic male figure can either be a pirate or like one of these three things, and like this is the like first act, the second act, and the third act. And it was just very like, if anybody that submitted anything, it had to check all these boxes. So somewhere there's like a like Daniel Steele like short story that I've written. And
you can auto-generate one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe like a shared universe could come out of a role-playing game. I really don't like playing role-playing games, which is my one. That's my one thing. They kind of rub me the wrong way a little bit. But playing them, I like that they exist. I just don't like playing them. Pardon me. Yeah, I could imagine something like you're talking about evolving from that.
I was actually going to suggest that. That's the one creative thing I really actually have done is work on role-playing games, and that lends itself to that because people can make different modules inside, inside the system. So if you have a system set up and a universe set up, then different people can write adventures and modules inside of it. It's literally designed to be a modular system of storytelling, so that could make it perfect for that kind of thing.
Yeah, the RPG community is great on that. Everybody just takes it and runs with it. It's really easy to do as well. I wanted to jump back, and we probably got to wrap up, guys. And I know we were asked this question a little while ago, but Auron, you were saying, should you read the rest of the Dune books? And now we're talking about sci-fi more generally. One thing did come to mind is that I do find that the kind of cyclical motif of like history repeating itself, or this sort of Spenglerian cycle, even if that is kind of necessary and effective in Dune, I do find it at this stage to be so canned and stock within sci-fi fantasy. I can almost kind of always see it coming. I mean, I think that Battlestar Galactica is something that did that too. And it almost, I guess if anybody's planning on writing pulp or the next Dune, do something other than ending it where it begins. I don't know if you
I mean,
similarly about that, but it's very kind of, I don't know, overdone at this point.
For anyone writing dark sci-fi, don't do what Battlestar Galactica did in its last 2 seasons. Whatever you do.
Oh, I will knife fight you about new Battlestar Galactica. I love that. I love that show so
No,
much.
I'm fine with the first 2 seasons. It started great. It just see where it ended.
I'm sorry. I love every bit of it.
Really?
Maybe
Even
that
last
just
season?
maybe I'm just a sucker. I love every moment of that show. I love the characters. I love the storyline. It is one of my very favorite things.
I
But
love.
I no argument about the first 2 seasons there. Just where it ended up.
I loved. I didn't like the way it ended either, but I loved there was an episode called I think it was 33 or something. It was just a number, and the premise was that somewhere amongst the fleet of like 40 ships or whatever it was, the Cylons had a tracker. And they didn't know where it was.
Mm-hmm.
And it meant that they had like something like 33 minutes. So they jumped out of space, and then they had about 33 minutes. It could have been an hour. I can't remember. But they had like a set amount of time before then the Cylons, with their overwhelming force, found out where they were and then jumped into space. And when the episode came in, they all had big beards on. The girls, like the women, didn't have makeup on for days and days because it came out. It was revealed that they'd actually been going through this for days and days and days, just on a constant state of high alert. And then eventually they find out where the tracking system is, because they're all dropping dead with exhaustion. And it's on like a hospital ship or something, and you have the moral dilemma, like, and in the end, it's like, yeah, we're going to have to blow it up because it could be anywhere on that ship. We don't know, so the safest bet is to just blow the ship up. And I thought that was absolutely fantastic science fiction. Everything about it was top notch.
That was one of that episode is one of the true classic episodes of good science fiction writing. Right up there with Inner Light from Star Trek: The Next Generation, or the last All Good Things from The Next Generation, or a lot of episodes of The Twilight Zone. That's a classic.
Yeah, there's a lot of great episodes of that show. The one where Zarek tries to take over in the coup is just one of the tighter pieces of writing I've seen in sci-fi. Even the first episode, or the end of the miniseries, where he's giving this speech about you're looking at these bodies that are about to be shot into space, and I know what you're thinking. Are they the lucky ones? And just talking about the essential necessity of the human race to survive is. I like I said, I love the show, I'll just fangirl out about it, I guess. But
yeah, MacIntyre, and I didn't mean to throw shade on Battlestar. I think
I see how it is. You come on my stream, and then this, yeah.
There are parts where it jumps the shark, but I think you're all right. It has some of the best episodes of anything, and I liked it. But I do think it is an example of that cyclical, like, I don't know. Not every work of sci-fi or fantasy needs to be an Ouroboros, like a snake eating its tail. And that does seem like, I remember there's this episode of, I don't know if you know the show Party Down, but it's a show where one of the characters is an aspiring sci-fi writer, and he gets like drugged one episode, and he's been trying to, like, through the whole season, he's trying to write his sci-fi masterpiece, and they're kind of poking fun at it. And he gets too stoned, and then all of a sudden he's like, wait, the aliens that they're fighting are themselves from the future. I got it. And I thought that was like kind of a jab at the this motif that keeps coming back. I mean, I don't want to sound anti-Spenglerian or like I don't think it can be quite effectively, or that it was in Dune, but I do feel like sometimes things end at a place other than where they begin.
Yeah, I used to. I mean, as far as the aesthetic, I used to play a lot of the Final Fantasy games before it became rubbish. Mm-hmm. It's sort of from
likewise
Final Fantasy 7 up until about 10 or something. But anyway, what I liked about it was that sometimes you would wander a remote part of the map, and you'd see like a sort of spire from a skyscraper. It's like popping through the ground, or like a road would just kind of break above the surface of the sand and these kinds of things. And it was never actually explained what had happened or what civilization was there. It was just like that. And it added such depth because you really thought, like, I wonder what happened here. Like, I wonder what this civilization was. And sometimes it would be hinted at, or you'd get a few clues. But oftentimes it wasn't. There was one of them which had all of the islands. It was on an archipelago, and they really went all in on explaining what had happened there. They had that time thing. But by and large, just I think it's an aesthetic. And people think of this with Dune as well, like of like dilapidated buildings in Arrakis, but it isn't actually the case. Like Dune, Arrakis has always been a bit of a barren wasteland. It's also like a backwater as well as far as planets go in that world, in that universe. But that aesthetic is an interesting one, I think.
Well, before we wrap things up, did anybody have any other like themes or important parts of Dune?
I thought I would just finish on this last, because I got quite a few quotes and whatnot, and the one that I like the most is this is again the collected sayings of Muad'Dib. Arrakis teaches the attitude of the knife, chopping off what's incomplete and saying, "Now it's complete because it ended here." And I thought that's Dune summed up in a nutshell there.
Oh, that I'll give my favorite Dune quote, and I hope I'm not butchering it. God created Arrakis to test the faithful.
Mm-hmm.
And here I thought everyone was going to quote the one where this has been way overquoted recently. When I have power, I ask for. When you have power, I ask for my rights according to your principle, etc., etc.
Yeah. That one is.
But anyway, I don't have a good quote ready to go, so.
Fair enough. All right, well, let me run down these super chats real quick. We got Spaghetto for $5. Just wanted to congratulate the Distributist on finally escaping the socialist tinderbox in which he currently lives. Early welcome to the good coast. Did you move, Dave? Did I not?
I haven't moved yet. I'm going to be moving.
You're escaping.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Congratulations.
Yeah. The rumor mill's working overtime on that one.
Oh, okay.
But yeah.
Gotcha.
Dave, I don't want to. You don't have to tell me or dox us, but if you're moving to the East Coast, hit me up.
Yeah, I am. I think I will be for at least a few years. But yeah, well, I'll leave that details of that and not to a public stream
in different forums. Yeah. All right. Bolero there. The pause is more syphilis and Morgoth is stepping over it. Yes, absolutely.
But Jonathan Bowden pill there. I get the reference, Bolero.
What's the full quote?
Liberalism is moral syphilis, and I'm stepping over it. This is Jonathan Bowden line.
Gotcha. All right, we got Dimitri Garlic here for $5. Have any of you read Man's World, right-wing mag with some stories by Zero HP Lovecraft? Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the one I was thinking of. That Rog Nationalist puts out. I see these things. It is. Okay. Yeah, it goes through. Yeah, this stuff goes through my Twitter feed, and so Zero HP follows me in there, so I see his stuff pretty often. But so sometimes I see his stories and sometimes I don't. But I thought he and a couple other kind of right wing Twitter type writers were contributing to that. So that's a place you can definitely check out. That is somebody who's actively making kind of science fiction or horror inside the realms we're talking about. But I think that's about it, guys. Did we want to touch on anything else before we head out? I know it was funny. People are like, because I didn't realize this before we got on the stream. We were just realizing this as we're getting started, but I didn't realize that Dave and Morgoth had never been on a stream. And glad I could bring you guys finally together on such an important topic.
Well, the first of many, I think. So I've really enjoyed it. Good stuff.
Yeah, I did.
We're looking at the A team here, guys. The A team.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to get to people. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, as great as it is to go into like the 5th hour of like plebs versus aristocrats and like nationalists versus NRX or whatever. But like, I would much rather bring community together to talk about like art that we enjoy than like hash those out endlessly. Like, there are things that need to be talked about. Don't get me wrong, but I think we need this stuff just as much as we need the 90th video on tactics. You know what I mean?
I mean,
I'm guilty of that for sure.
One last question: do the plebs not win in June?
Well, after an aristocrat leads them.
Yeah.
Right.
Paul Atreides as a 10.
Yes.
Academic agent as the Benny Gesserit.
That's right.
Yeah. And Cigar Stream his Gom Jabbar then.
Yeah. Paul Atreides is a 10.
What's in the cigar stream? Pain. Yeah.
Oh man!
All right, then we have one more snuck in here. Argyle Euphoria for 49. Thank you guys for donating. Appreciate it. Thanks for making 2020 somewhat bearable. Yeah, guys. No, I like I said, I always want to stop by and make some more of these streams because I love theory and everything, and I think it's important to make those videos and have those discussions. I think it's just important to have periods where the community stops and everybody can kind of get together and enjoy something and talk about art or life or different things. I honestly wish I made more of this type of content in general, but at least getting streams together is, everybody can bring a different perspective and enjoy it.
Absolutely.
Yep.
All right, guys.
And I'm definitely up for a Warhammer stream, but the Horus Heresy. But yeah, I'm well versed, so yeah, that will be a fun one too, I think.
Yeah. So the fun thing is, I am super familiar with the codexes for 40K because I played the game like tournaments a lot. So like I read every codex because I'm that guy who needed to know how every army worked so I could defeat like everything. So I know all the lore from the codexes, but I've only read a couple of the novels. So I'm not really in depth. Like I've read a couple of Horus Heresy novels and then like a few of the short stories and stuff in between, but I don't know the whole universe in depth from the actual Black Library stuff.
Could people give me some suggestions? Like if people want to read the Horus Heresy, I would love to discuss the Horus Heresy. Oftentimes, I've seen a number of 40K streams, and oftentimes the problem is, and I'm not so sure if this alternative would work, but the problem I've seen is that everyone has a different element of 40K that they like.
Right.
And so it sort of becomes like the Rumi's elephant, the story of the blind man and the elephant, whereas it's just 5 different people talking about the individual anatomy part of the elephant that they particularly like. Whereas if I wanted to talk to you guys on Warhammer, I would really like it if we could break that pattern and like deep dive on something like the Horus Heresy books. Like just get around all the talking points that you usually get from these live streams about Warhammer and like laser focus on one thing. And I haven't read I've read an Eisenhorn novel like 10 years ago, but I would be more than happy to do that assigned reading if for a more deep dive focused stream.
Well, let's make it the first Horus Heresy book then, because I've read that one. I'm assuming Morgoth has, and so that way everybody will have. We'll have that down.
Sweet.
Also, I'm seeing Philip K. Dick stream. I would also really like to do that author. That's one I was thinking about. I don't know about you guys, but
yeah, I love him.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. I really, if you haven't read Men in the High Castle, like the show's fine. Read the book. It's really interesting the way the characters think differently depending on which regime is in charge of them, which is wildly politically incorrect now, which is what makes it very interesting. But yeah, I would also love to put a Philip K. Dick one together. I think that would be great.
Yeah, that's another one where I think like
we'd have to pick a couple books and focus.
Yeah, I can't even imagine walking into I mean, it's hard not to talk about Dune given how deep it is, but at least it's one work. Sure. With Philip K. Dick, I mean, you're just going to be here for like, it's going to be like the Rumi elephant problem all over again.
Well, I think we do what we did with Herbert, what we did with Heinlein, where we picked like 3 books and we're like, okay, that way, like we can move from one to one, compare them between the 3. So I'll start putting some of those together so that we can figure that out. But that said, thanks everybody for coming on. Don't want to keep everybody too long, so we really appreciate everybody who stopped by. Once again, if you're watching the stream, I'm sure you're subbed to Morgoth and Dave, but if by some miracle you are not, go fix that. Make sure you sub to Last Things. All of that is in the description below. If you haven't subbed to my channel, please go ahead and do that. We appreciate everybody who was super chatting, donating, had some really good comments, and everybody following along in the chat, so really appreciate it. And once again, everybody, thanks for coming on, and we will talk to you next time.
Thanks for hosting, MacIntyre. Take care.
Thank you guys. See you later.